What is up, guys? Lord Nick here, bringing you another One Piece related video. It's been a long time, guys, but I'm back. I've really kind of been enjoying the OP-06 meta now that it's kind of unfolding a bit. My local meta, at least, has been a lot less Sakazukis, which the current iteration of Sakazuki has become an absurdly bad matchup for me in playing Rebecca. I've had to do a lot of testing, a lot of rebuilding, a lot of figuring out how to best build Rebecca into this format. I found one that I generally like, though there were a handful of cards that I kind of want to switch out, um, and I just don't know how to do it without kind of ruining some of the tempo the deck has and the ability to search certain cards. I just don't really know how to do it. But let's get into the meat and potatoes of it, guys. It is another Rebecca deck. This is specifically my OP-06 build. I do have an OP-06.5 build, which is in the inclusion of EVO1, which I will be testing out and playing more once that happens. But for the current iteration of it, guys, let's kind of get into the main structure of what this deck is. This deck I am formulating as the Fortress Rebecca, and because of that, I might actually drop Orlumbus, though there has been some times where just playing Orlumbus to KO himself has been very useful. He might drop out, and I might put in like Ice Ages or Helmephos. I think both of those would probably end up being better optional tools than him, and most likely will be the route that I will end up going. Might actually even see an Idio or two in there as well, just because in certain matchups like Yamato, Idio can just win us the game by stalling out her early attacks and just being a nuisance of a card for her early on. Anyhow, the way this one works, why is it Fortress Yamato? What about this makes this Fortress? The Fortress deck is about locking people out and making it impossible for them to do anything. Well, this deck kind of functions in a similar way. And the reason for that is on our 8 Dawn turn, we really want to drop our Aramaki on board. Now, the reason Orlumbus is good is because of Aramaki. If Orlumbus is on board, we can sack Orlumbus to himself at bare minimum, -4 something, and then be able to discard a card from our hand and get rid of a 6 cost with Aramaki the turn he comes out, which is pretty good tempo swing. If not, Aramaki on his own is an 8 drop, 8k blocker who every turn can Houndblaze himself. This is a card that I think a lot of people are sleeping on in his potential. Now, Houndblazing himself is pretty good, but it doesn't mean that our blocker has to attack. So for finishing games, it's phenomenal. Otherwise, it's just a removal every single turn, which is very good, and it's a bottom deck removal. So sticky things like Borsalinos or somebody Sabos something doesn't matter as long as we can get the cost reduction. And the next big guy that we're running is 3 Kuzan. 3/10 drop Kuzan does that job. On curve, dropping a Kuzan when I already have an Aramaki out is destructive power. If they saboed the turn before to try to prepare for it, okay, cool. We don't get to KO anything with Kuzan potentially, but we could still get rid of a 7 cost with Aramaki, which is great. This is huge tempo swing, but in most situations, because we're not always against black, an Aramaki into a Kuzan means we get rid of a 5 cost and a 7 cost card in the same turn and develops 2 gigantic bodies on our board. Most people cannot come back from this, let alone if you end up having to draw. You end up happening to draw a second Kuzan, which then allows you to just go Kuzan into Kuzan with an Aramaki. Everything's dead. Nothing survives. Everything's dead. It's game basically. So these 2 cards kind of make up our late game, which is the fortress element of it. Once Kuzan hits, it is very difficult to deal with this. Aramaki just gives us the curve to get there, and everything else is about stalling out until we can get to this, which I think Rebecca is actually exceptionally good at doing. She's been known for being a stall deck. She's been known for being this deck that is kind of wanting to go late, and I'd previously been trying to build her kind of like Sakazuki because the answers were really there, but they weren't, and the real reason I kind of switched to this tempo of it is because of Aramaki. This particular card has just enabled me to be able to build this way on Rebecca, and it feels phenomenal. It feels so good. Because previously what I would end up having to do, if I really wanted to do this, would be, without Aramaki, without Gecko Moria, my top end would be Kuzans, which are great, but there's not really anything that was on the field beforehand that usually stuck as easily, right? Yeah, you could talk about our Cavendish, right? You could have a Cavendish out, and that's great. That's great synergy. Luffy didn't have any synergy with Kuzan. So like a lot of the previous top ends that Rebecca ran didn't synergize with Kuzan at all. It's just the fact that Kuzan could kind of synergize with an Orlumbus combo. You could Orlumbus into a Kuzan to remove a 9 cost. That's pretty useful. But you'd have to have so many blockers developed, and your build path had to be completely different. You had to play it a lot slower. This deck, you do have to play it a lot slower as well, but the payoff feels so much better. You know, because now when I'm swinging with Kuzan, the turn after I play Kuzan, I can play Sabo, I can play Rebecca. I have so many more options. It's just because there's been 2 sets since the initial Rebecca build that I think that the Kuzan top end has become more important. I honestly just really love this deck, and to kind of prove how good this deck ended up being was the fact that last night, I wish I had footage, I wish I recorded my games, I wish I did all the stuff. At my locals, I decided to go into it with this current list, the list that you were seeing before you. I went in with this exact list. I beat up 2 Gecko Morias round 1 and 2, and in round 3, I drew kind of a dud hand, but also kind of misplayed into an aggro Yamato. We played a game after that, and I demolished it. He's a really good player. He's a nice guy. So I'm not going to talk any shit. I think he played it well, and I think I played it kind of poorly. And there's a little bit of luck on his side of the fact that I drew nothing but no counters after my initial hand. So I kind of got stuck in a situation of, like we got stuck for a while. So it just kind of, this deck has its inherent strengths, which is once we get to late game, almost no deck can challenge us. The 10-drop Kuzan allows us to deal with yellow a lot. The Aramaki allows us to deal with yellow a lot. Having the option to do something like a Rebecca into a Hina into a Lucci when we already have a Kuzan out means we can get rid of a mid-cost card and a late-game card. We actually have the ability to just dealing with our opponent. Having a permanent Ice Age on an near irremovable body is just insanely potent against most decks. And in the late game, yellow wants to just be dropping 1 bomb a turn. And if they want to drop 1 bomb a turn, I can easily remove 1 bomb a turn because my 2 big guys are just out of range of any other removal most of the time. On top of that, having the Aramakis means we always have a blocker that they can't tap down with with any of their cards. You know, green has a strong difficulty with it other than the fact that Hody Jones is a way around it. So what are our bad matchups? What are our good matchups? This list thrives against a lot of aggro decks. We can stall them out. We get to the late game. They can't do anything. It is very, very good against mid-range and late game decks, which sounds really weird. It's like, okay, so what is the weak matchups, right? Like, what are we bad into? Well, the bad things that we're into is stuff we can't starve out as easily. So Reiju is actually a very difficult deck for us to deal with. Despite being able to throw up blocker after blocker after blocker, we just never really get the tempo to be able to clear her board properly. We don't run Colosseum, so our characters don't come out with rush to clear things. If we made it a more traditional Rebecca build, we might be able to actually deal with Reiju better. But because we aren't a traditional Rebecca, it is kind of a difficult deck for us to be able to consistently deal with. What are other things that we struggle against? Well, other than Reiju, the Yamato matchup is relatively 50-50 against the aggro Yamato. We do really well into Fortress because they want to go late, and we like going late, and we kind of just punish them in the late game. The other deck that we're really rough into is Sakazuki, and that's because instead of putting stuff in trash, he bottom decks everything. And so bottom decking our mid-game cards is very problematic because then we just lose a lot of our recursion value. He has ways of dealing with our Borsalinos, he has ways of dealing with our Sabos, he has ways of getting rid of our Rebeccas, our Luccis, all this stuff. Sakazuki is just a menace of a deck, and I don't think it's a big surprise that he's a bad matchup for us. But out of the top decks, what are the top of the other 2 top decks? Do we do well into them? Well into Gecko Moria, based off of last night. Yes, I've played against 2 different variants of Gecko Moria yesterday, and I handily beat the first one. And the second one was kind of a nail biter, but he played 3 Gecko Morias, and I still closed out the game with him having no Gecko Morias on the board. And there was just nothing he could do. He just could not win against me at that point. Once we got to late game, I just outvalue trained him the entire rest of the late game, and he couldn't do anything about it. Because we were just dropping 3 blockers, and it became a loop of just like Rebecca into Sabo, because I didn't have to remove anything else because Aramaki, I just discard one of the cards in my hand, and I can remove anything that's a legitimate threat that's 7 cost or less. And that became very difficult for him to deal with. On top of that, that's only 1 swing a turn, but what it meant was that I was only swinging Kuzan at him for like 2, 3 turns in a row. So it took a couple extra turns, but he could never get to my Kuzan. So, it's instead of just like a fortress build, I guess it's get down, Mr. President kind of build. It's getting 10 drop Kuzan out with Aramaki and then protecting the crap out of both of them. And so, outside of that, right? Like, okay, what's the other one? Katakuri. Well, I've already just told you that against yellow, we want to go late. And yellow likes going late usually because it's like, oh, yeah, Big Mom, we could do that. I can sit at 1-0 life for probably about 7 turns against yellow as I'm whittling them down. And guess what? Anything that triggers off of life that gives them a character on board, I just hold my Lucci and I can drop a Lucci and remove them both. And now they're stuck. And all I have to do is produce 1, maybe 2 blockers a turn. If I can get a Sabo out every turn, they're just stuck in a scenario that they can't do anything against me. 1, they can't KO my characters, and then they can't Amaru past my blockers because my blockers are Aramaki Sabo. So it's just like, well, shoot, like I can toss Dawn on my leader and swing this giant thing and kill one of your characters essentially. Or I can try to develop a character and swing a low leader, and then you get to keep your board. So by the time we're into late game, because my life is so low and my opponent is down to usually like 3, maybe 3 or so life, my opponent's on the clock. He can keep healing every turn, sure, but I will remove his characters every single turn. And there is nothing Katakuri can do about it. So Katakuri has to beat you up early. He has to do enough damage to you early, develop a big enough board to be able to keep you from being able to clear it. But the deck is built about turtling up and clearing boards. So it actually ends up becoming a very advantageous matchup for us now. Whereas previous iterations of Rebecca that I've run, previous ways that I've built her, have struggled against Katakuri. And even in this meta, at the beginning, I was struggling against Katakuri, thinking to myself, dang, this is just an instant loss. Because I was going a build that was reliant on running 4 Gecko Morias, just trying to do this recursion thing, which is kind of the tempo-y build that Sakazuki runs off of. And we just can't do it as well because our leader doesn't have pressure like that. So because of that, we have to take a slower route. And it took me way too long to kind of realize that's how this has to go with a lot of these meta decks for Rebecca, is that you have to take a slower, grindier matchup, as she always has. But, we just have better tools to do it now. Luffy was a very aggressive late game tool. He required your opponent to remove it. And against Sakazuki, he got removed. Against Katakuri, he got swung into. And if you didn't have a developed board of blockers, like, you just weren't going to be able to protect him. With Amaru coming in, it became harder to protect him. But now, with the fact that we have so many cards we have 8 cards that are above 5 costs that are blockers. That are 5 costs or above that are blockers. We then also have another, we have another 6 4-cost blockers and 4 3-cost blockers. So there's constant thought of me, though, at this point. I was like, do I drop the Orlumbuses or not? But there's been times where the Orlumbus has just been able to just like, oh, he KOs himself, it's fine. Or he drops out, KOs a Leo, and then I can play another Leo or something. So the Orlumbuss has felt okay in certain scenarios. It's just because we don't have as much Dressrosa, it feels a little bit awkward. And we don't have as much Dressrosa that we want to KO. There's 6 cards that he really wants to KO outside of himself. And those KOing himself actually sometimes has been to play. So how do I rate this deck? Where would I put this deck? I would say this deck has solidified itself in my mind, the way that I've played it, the things that I've played against. It solidifies itself in the same tier that Yamato and Reiju were kind of sitting at. I don't think it's a god tier deck at all, but it has pretty solid matchups into 2 of the 3 best decks in the format. And the third one is just an overpowered deck that almost nobody can really deal with consistently. So the fact that it does really well into 2 of the 3 best decks, and then is 50-50 with one of the next best decks, it pretty much auto loses to Reiju, because the way that we play is about starving our opponent out, going to late, stuff like that, and Reiju really kind of just is able to punish us with big giant rushers. That also means that we can't keep our blockers alive because he constantly reduces the cost of our blockers. So, I mean, Reiju is probably our worst matchup, but outside of that, we handle the top meta pretty well with this build. So I would recommend giving it a shot, guys. It plays, like I said, beware that it plays very slow, and sometimes the optimum play is just like, all right, turn 2, I drop a Bardos, draw a card off of my leader ability, pass turn. And it's okay. You know, stalling out and getting delayed, we are a late game monster. So just play for that condition, and I think you'll do fine. Hopefully you guys like this video. Maybe you like this deck list. Maybe you've been playing a deck list similar to this, and I want to hear about it. I want to see it. Leave comments down below. Leave a like. I'm back, guys. I'm going to try to get more contents out, and once we get EBO1 coming out, I'll show you the list that I'm going to be testing in EBO1. The closer we get to it, I might come up with some spicy builds for something like Heroes as well, just because I'm a big Dressrosa stan, so I kind of want to just, you know, maybe we'll actually work on some other decks other than Rebecca. Until the next video, guys, I hope you have yourselves a wonderful, wonderful day. Bye, guys.